Muy buenas tardes, damas y caballeros de YouTube. Today we're going in deep about genetics. Do you have bad genetics? Puede ser. Or maybe you've got amazing genetics, but you just don't know it yet. Like I've said before, you can't really be too sure of these things if you haven't given weight training or some kind of resistance training a fair shot for an extended period of time before. So here, let me help you out a bit. Number one thing you've got to do is be honest. So over the years, as I've gotten in better shape, I've had some people, like friends or coworkers or some folks over at the gym ask me for some advice relating to diet or to lifting, okay? And upon me answering whatever question they might have had, I have heard the same dumb over and over again. Things along the lines of, I've always been kind of chubby, my family's kind of chubby, we're big boned, I can't go below this body fat, I'm just not made for that. Sure. The other one I've heard is almost the opposite of that. I've always been skinny, I've never been very strong, and no matter how heavy I lift and how hard I try, I just can't put any muscle, I can't gain any weight. But the one thing that all of these people have in common es que ninguno tiene ni la más mínima idea de qué mierda está hablando. People love to use bad genetics as a scapegoat line to excuse their lack of discipline and hard work, while making it sound like they're actually working really hard to obtain things. And I just don't really buy into this excuse anymore. Another thing that bugs me almost more than that is years ago, when I was doing my own research on how to get over my crappy genetics, I would look up stuff on YouTube such as how to get over my narrow shoulders, how to get over my bad insertions, and there were a few videos. What they had in common though was that, I'd click on one with a title such as How I Fixed My Bad Genetics. Cool, let's take a look. I click on it, and it's some guy with coat hanger clavicles, like giant wrists, a tiny waist, tall, and I'm just thinking to myself, what bad genetics?
What bad genetics? What are you talking about?
Get out of here.
If you're watching this, I'm going to assume that you think you've inherited some bad genes, or maybe you don't, but maybe you want to know what makes good and bad genetics, and you would think obviously this is a matter of simple visual deduction. It is, yes, to an extent, but there's actually a lot more happening under the surface than you would think, so let me help you out with that. Okay, let's start with your skeletal frame and your muscle bellies. As a guy, what you would want is a wide clavicle to narrow waist or hip ratio. Why? Because these proportions are what gives you that V-taper shape that you usually see in athletes or in men's health magazines or whatever. And if you happen to have wide shoulders and a narrow waist, you probably look athletic, even if you're not really athletic. Our subconscious just happens to relate that V-taper shape directly to athleticism. On the flip side of this, having a narrow clavicle to wide waist ratio sucks ass, because you could train for a few years and still not get that V-taper shape that you want. How do you assess this? You just look at the mirror, that's all you have to do. If your clavicles happen to align straight down with your hip bones, you're in for a rough time. Now, muscle bellies son extremadamente importantes because they're gonna give you a fairly clear understanding of how your muscles are going to look once you actually train them for a while. That way, you're going to avoid feeling disappointed once you do train for a while and end up looking nothing like you thought you would, which is exactly what happened to me. The way most people refer to muscle bellies is related to how high or how low they sit on the respective tendons. Y yo tengo el ejemplo perfecto para ustedes. I do have to move slightly away from the mic for the example, so please just bear with the crappy audio for a minute. So, like I've mentioned before, I've got really crappy muscle insertions, namely my biceps. My biceps sit really high up on the respective tendons. Let me show you. So, this is me flexing my bicep at a fairly straight 90-degree angle. Notice anything peculiar? There is a gap. Right here, between the bicep, between the forearm, that gap is empty, it's just a tendon. There's nothing there. So, in the world of aesthetics, being able to fit just one finger in there is already considered pretty bad. I can fit almost 3 fingers in that gap. Take a look. 3 fingers. It's like 2.5 fingers. I can comfortably sit 2 fingers in there. So, what does this mean? Look, that gap will never close. It'll always be there because your muscle just doesn't sit on that portion of your tendon. This, however, does not mean that you should just give up on your biceps or whatever other muscle part you have that, you know, just doesn't sit the way you want it to on its tendon. What this does mean is that you could do preacher curls till kingdom come, but that gap will never close. Yes, your muscle will grow, but it's gonna grow in the exact same place that it is. It's not like there will come a day in which you will do so many bicep curls that your bicep is just gonna pour over and close that gap. So you have to temper your expectations and know that some of the results you might be after are just not feasible for you and for your body type. And there's nothing wrong with that because it's not like it's your fault. I do have one very small yet helpful tip when it comes to biceps and only biceps. If you have high muscle insertions in your biceps, then don't flex at a 90-degree angle the way I did. Flex with a neutral grip, meaning this. Not this. This. That kind of cheats it so that it doesn't look like you have a gap, even though it's still there. But hey, it's better than nothing. I, however, did not know this when I first started training. Nobody had told me about this, and I was not really even aware of the concept of good or bad genetics for training. So after 2 years of smashing my biceps as hard as I could quite often, they grew, yeah, they grew, and like my bicep peak got a lot more pronounced, but the gaps never filled out, and I was fairly devastated by that. So what I'm trying to say overall is temper your expectations. Temper your expectations, please. Don't cry about it. Just be aware that you might have some aesthetic limitations. Así es la vida. A veces negra, a veces rosa. Those were just 2 examples of muscle bellies, but do be aware that without any previous training experience, you're not really going to know if your larger muscle groups such as your chest or your lats or your quads have some dope-ass growth potential, because those muscle groups are much more complicated, have much more complex ranges of motion and insertions that your biceps and your calves don't have. On the more slightly complicated side of things, there are concepts such as muscle fiber size, injury proclivity, and how well your body activates slow twitch and fast twitch muscle fibers. Let us get an easy and simple one out of the way. Muscle cells. Some people have larger muscle cells than other people. Yeah, that's it. Bigger muscle cells, bigger muscles. Slow and fast twitch muscle fibers. Slow twitch muscle fibers serve the purpose of endurance. So think something like long distance running, where on the other hand, fast twitch muscle fibers are not so much linked to endurance as they are to things like explosive power. Fast twitch muscle fibers grow relatively larger in size to slow twitch muscle fibers, and some people just happen to be born with a higher ratio of fast twitch muscles than slow twitch muscles. And in all likelihood, these individuals probably have a superior potential to, both develop mass and strength. You're either born like this or you're not. O sea, ¿qué se le puede hacer, no? There also happen to be people who are born with more muscle cells than others. And mind you, I'm not talking about muscle fiber size, I'm just talking about muscle cells in general. So I don't think I need to elaborate much more on this one. More muscle cells, more muscle. Now, mind you, these things that I have just mentioned are not always self-evident, and they're going to be case-by-case scenarios. So you might not really know your body well enough to make a call on these until you've, again, trained for about a year or 2. Personally speaking, even though I've been doing this for many years, I find that I'm still discovering some new things about my body every now and then. Now, let's move away from muscle bellies and your skeletal structure, all that stuff for a second, and let's talk about fat deposits. Not everyone distributes fat around their body the exact same way. I mean, men have a tendency to store fat around their midsection more so than women. Speaking personally, I do store almost all of my body fat in my belly. I mean, for example, I start showing some definition and vascularity to a certain degree in my arms at body fats as high as, I want to say 18%, which is definitely not the norm. But at the same time, I don't start seeing the outline of my abs or even losing my love handles until I'm at a body fat of something like 13%, which is also not the norm. Most guys start showing the outline of their abs, provided they've trained them at least a little bit, at around 15%. Okay, cool. Now that we've got most of the basics covered, you might be thinking to yourself, okay, cool Sandro, I'm listening to you. And turns out I've got terrible genetics. So what do I do? What do I do? You tailor your lifestyle around it. I mean, I've identified that I've got narrow clavicles, wide waist, a proclivity to gain weight easily, and crappy things like that. So I started doing a number of things differently. First of all, I made a checklist with, the things that I wanted to achieve, and I just tackled them. My new priorities were to maximize development in my traps, lats, and shoulders to compensate for my incredibly narrow frame, and then to lose weight until I reached a body fat low enough so that I could really sculpt out the shapes of those muscles and get some of that V-taper going on. At the time that I made that checklist, I already had close to, say, 3 years of experience lifting, so combining that experience with my new priorities, I decided to make a new custom routine that would work out for me. So, what I had found out about my own body during those years of training was that even though I had a weak chest, weak arms, and fairly weak shoulders, I could make some significant gains in both strength and size with my legs and my lats without ever really getting hard stuck. For those two muscle groups, the improvement always felt linear and comfortable. So what I decided to do was to eliminate deadlifts entirely from my routine and to cut my 2 leg days a week to 1 leg day a week. Cool, so now I had an extra 2 days to work out whatever muscle group I wanted to work out, which in my case was my back and my shoulders, so that I could, again, grow a little bit in that area which would help me with my small frame. And that's exactly what I did. I allocated back and shoulders to one of those days, and the other day was filled in with accessory workouts, meaning smaller muscle groups that need a little bit of dedicated weight time, like biceps, triceps, calves, and rear delts. Not gonna lie, going into the gym for the first time to do my new custom routine was kind of nerve-wracking because my preconceived notion on what working out should be at that time, given the research I had done and the advice that I was seeing on forums, was that you absolutely have to do legs twice a week and that there's no way that you can do without deadlifts. Says who? Says who? I mean, the advice that I want to give you guys on this channel is going to be about how to grow all of your body, okay? It's going to be about all of it. But if you only want to smash your biceps, for example, okay, I know people make fun of those guys who work out their biceps like 4 or 5 times a week, and yeah, it is kind of funny, but who the fuck cares? If you think you're gonna look your best if you just blow out your biceps and they get huge, then do it. Dude, do it, go for it, just roll with it. There is no such thing as an authority out there that can tell you you're supposed to train like this and you're supposed to look like this. No, I mean, even though I dropped deadlifts completely and I was only working out my legs once a week, my legs look just fine, and the actual result of following my new custom routine for something like 2 or 3 months was some unprecedented growth in my back that I had never experienced before. I mean, I just like blew it out, and for the very first time, I actually started noticing my V-taper. Like, dude, I felt like fucking Zangief. And that's all I've got for today. I would, however, encourage that you guys Google any of the terms or the things that I've talked about today, because what I've presented is essentially the working knowledge. It's the basics of what you should know about these concepts, but you know, you can definitely read more in depth about them. And I would recommend that because even if you don't need it, it's kind of interesting to read about. R con R cigarro, R con R barril, rápido corren los carros, en el ferrocarril. Buenas noches. I can fit almost 3 fingers in that gap.